Hello, my friend. Tonight we dive deep into the most bizarre sexual practices of the medieval world, a period often shrouded in romantic myths, yet, in reality, far stranger and more complex than any storybook. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself stepping back in time, tramping through muddy, winding streets. The air is thick with the smells of wood smoke, livestock, and something less savory from the gutters. You hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the distant bleating of sheep, and the chatter of merchants hawking their wares in a bustling marketplace. Timber-framed houses lean precariously over the narrow lanes, casting long shadows. But beneath this seemingly rustic and pious exterior, hidden within the ancient stones of castles and the hushed sanctity of cathedrals, lay a labyrinthine world of desire, societal taboos, and astonishingly peculiar habits that would make your modern sensibilities do a profound double-take. Fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey with your innocent notions of the past entirely intact. But frankly, that's where the true adventure begins, isn't it? So, before you get too comfortable and drift off, take a quick moment to like the video and subscribe. But remember, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to drop your location and local time in the comments below. It's genuinely fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from across the globe. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and let's ease into tonight's rather eye-opening journey together. We often tend to view the Middle Ages through a very specific lens, one of unwavering piety, rigid social structures, and perhaps a touch of medieval stoicism, and to a significant extent, this perception holds water. A foundational historical fact is that the Church wielded immense power, shaping nearly every aspect of daily life, from laws to social customs. Public life, and certainly the official discourse, was dominated by Christian doctrine, which, for the most part, advocated for abstinence, chastity, and generally viewed earthly pleasures, especially sexual ones, with considerable suspicion. When sex was addressed openly, it was almost exclusively framed within the confines of marriage and for the express purpose of procreation. You can easily conjure an image of stern-faced priests thundering sermons from pulpits about the perils of lust, the dangers of the flesh, and the eternal damnation awaiting those who strayed. And indeed, such sermons were a commonplace occurrence. Yet, juxtaposed against this seemingly unyielding backdrop of strict religious observance lay a surprisingly vibrant, often contradictory, and sometimes shockingly liberal landscape of human desire and sexual expression. It's almost as if medieval people, much like their modern counterparts, possessed an uncanny ability to compartmentalize, to hold wildly opposing viewpoints simultaneously, one eye devoutly fixed on the promise of heaven, the other, perhaps, indulging in a rather more earthly delight. Consider, for example, a truly fascinating and somewhat quirky insight into medieval morality, the Penitentiary. These were thick, often unwieldy books used by confessors, acting as detailed guides for assigning penance for various sins. They weren't just simple lists like "don't commit adultery." Oh, far from it. These texts delved into the minutiae of sexual acts with an almost astonishing specificity. They detailed various sexual positions, the frequency of intercourse, and even the nature of one's thoughts or intentions during intimate moments, assigning specific periods of fasting, prayer, or other forms of penance for each transgression. You might find a relatively lighter penance for what they termed intercourse in the manner of beasts, which essentially covered most non-missionary positions as animals, presumably. Don't practice the missionary position then for, say, masturbation, or coitus interruptus withdrawal, which was considered a severe sin against procreation. It's almost like a medieval instruction manual for bedroom activities, except instead of helpful tips for pleasure, it offered dire warnings and strict penalties. You can practically hear the awkward murmurs in the confessional booth as a parishioner sheepishly admitted to a forbidden act, knowing they'd faced weeks on a diet of bread and water. The very existence of such incredibly detailed prohibitions, rather than suggesting a society devoid of sexual variation, strongly implies a much richer, more varied, and dare I say, more inventive sexual reality beneath the surface of official dogma. The precise extent to which these penitentials accurately reflected widespread practices versus merely being an exhaustive inventory of all potential sins the clergy worried about remains a complex point of academic discussion. It's akin to a modern legal code attempting to anticipate and legislate against every conceivable petty infraction, just in case. Regardless, the chasm between the Church's pious ideals and the messy realities of human desire was, as it always is, a vast and fascinating space, and we've only just begun to peer into its depths. So, you've got this idea of medieval people, right? All buttoned up, praying constantly, perhaps a bit stiff. But remember that detailed list of sins from the penitentials we just talked about. That wasn't just for monks and nuns. It was for everyone, and it gives us a real peek into what was actually happening, or at least what the Church worried was happening. Now, let's narrow our focus a bit and talk about something truly fundamental to medieval life, marriage. You might think, well, marriage is marriage, right? Not quite. In the Middle Ages, particularly among the common folk, marriage wasn't always the grand, romantic affair you see in movies. A mainstream historical fact is that it was primarily a social and economic contract, far more than a spiritual union. In its early forms, you weren't just marrying a person. You were often marrying into a family, a plot of land, or a trade. Imagine yourself a young person in a small village. Your parents, perhaps your entire family, would have a significant say in who you married. Love? Sure, it could blossom, but it was rarely the primary motivator for an arranged marriage, which was quite common. We know this from records of dowries, property transfers, and even the simple practicalities of running a household. For a man, a wife meant someone to manage the home, bear children, and contribute to the family's labor, whether in the fields or in a workshop. For a woman, a husband meant protection, provision, and a place in society. It was a partnership, but one firmly rooted in necessity and survival. This focus on practicalities meant that even the most intimate aspects of a relationship, like sexual relations, were often viewed through the lens of duty. The Church, in fact, taught that sex within marriage was primarily for procreation, though it grudgingly acknowledged it could also serve to prevent fornication. That's right, grudgingly is the key word there. It wasn't about fireworks and passionate embraces. It was about keeping you from sinning elsewhere. One fascinating detail that really highlights this blend of duty and desire. While the Church emphasized procreation, it also had incredibly specific rules about when you could have sex. There were specific closed seasons for marital relations, Lent, Advent, certain feast days, and even every Sunday. Imagine having to schedule your intimacy around the liturgical calendar. It sounds utterly baffling to us now, like trying to plan a romantic evening around a major sporting event, except with eternal damnation as the consequence for getting it wrong. If a couple had sex during these forbidden times, it was considered a sin, requiring confession and penance. This wasn't just a minor transgression, it was a serious breach of religious law. The open scholarly debate surrounding these rules often questions how widely they were truly observed, or if they were more of an ideal that people largely ignored in the privacy of their homes. You can almost hear the whispered conversations in medieval bedrooms. Is it Advent already? Darn it, I just got comfortable. It suggests a constant tension between the church's strictures and the very human realities of desire and companionship. The pressure to produce children, especially male heirs, was immense, particularly among the nobility and landowners. A barren wife could be a cause for divorce or annulment, or, at the very least, a source of great anxiety for the family line. This societal pressure naturally led to some interesting and often desperate measures to ensure fertility, but we'll get to those bizarre practices later. For now, just understand that the medieval marital bed wasn't just a place for rest. It was a crucible of expectations, duties, and often, despite all the rules, a surprising amount of genuine human connection. But don't let the rigid framework fool you. Beneath it, life found a way, just as it always does. The human heart and other organs are notoriously bad at following strict guidelines when it comes to matters of passion and procreation. Given the immense pressure to produce heirs, and the Church's rather restrictive views on when and why you should be intimate, you might wonder, what about contraception? You'd think, with all those rules and expectations, people would have been desperate for ways to control family size. And you'd be absolutely right. A mainstream historical fact is that contraception in the Middle Ages was a remarkably primitive and often dangerous affair, relying heavily on folk remedies, superstition, and a healthy dose of wishful thinking. Forget your modern pharmacies and neatly packaged pills. Medieval methods were more akin to something you'd whip up in a witch's cauldron, often with questionable, if any, efficacy. Consider the practical struggles. A family in medieval times might face harsh winters, meager harvests, or devastating plagues. More mouths to feed meant greater strain on already limited resources. For a couple, especially a woman, finding ways to prevent another pregnancy could be a matter of survival, not just convenience. So, what were their options? Well, one rather unusual approach involved wearing certain amulets or charms. You might tie the testicles of a weasel around your neck, or perhaps dan a dried mule's womb. Some believed that carrying a piece of a plant called savine could prevent conception, or that drinking a concoction of various herbs mixed with animal urine would do the trick. It's the kind of thing that makes you deeply grateful for modern medicine, isn't it? You can almost hear the nervous whispers. Are you sure this weasel bit works, Agnes? Because Bartholomew is getting rather enthusiastic. The sheer desperation implied by these methods speaks volumes about the very real need for birth control. Despite the Church's condemnation of any deliberate attempt to prevent conception, they certainly weren't just about rhythm methods, if you catch my drift. Beyond these more fantastical approaches, there were also various herbal remedies believed to have contraceptive properties. Plants like pennyroyal, rue, and tansy were frequently cited in medieval texts as abortifacients or contraceptives. These were often brewed into teas or concoctions, and while some did have properties that could induce menstruation or even miscarriage, often with great danger to the woman, their effectiveness as reliable contraception was, at best, inconsistent. It's easy to dismiss these as pure folly, But consider the limited knowledge of anatomy and reproductive biology at the time. People were simply trying everything they could based on observations and passed down wisdom. The open scholarly debate surrounding these practices often delves into the true extent of their use and their actual success rates, which are incredibly difficult to ascertain from the surviving records. It's hard to quantify failure rates when the medicine itself was so poorly understood. So, while the intention was clear, the outcome was often a roll of the dice, and a very risky one at that. And then there was the truly bizarre, sometimes involving magical incantations or rituals. Some texts describe burying certain objects in the ground or performing specific actions under the moon to prevent pregnancy. These weren't just medical practices. They were often interwoven with a worldview where magic and the natural world were intimately connected. It was a time when cause and effect were often attributed to unseen forces as much as to tangible actions. So, while you might find a recipe for a herbal potion in one manuscript, you might find instructions for a fertility spell in another, right alongside it. It was a world where science, superstition, and desperation formed a strange, often dangerous, cocktail in the quest to control, or rather, to avoid, new life. It truly highlights the fundamental human desire for control over one's own body and destiny, even when the tools available were, by our standards, utterly bonkers. Given the medieval struggle with unwanted pregnancies and the often grim reality of childbirth, it's perhaps no surprise that people also desperately sought ways to enhance fertility and desire. This brings us to the wonderfully weird world of aphrodisiacs. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medicine, heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories like the four humors, often prescribed dietary and herbal remedies to balance the body and stimulate various functions, including sexual arousal. These weren't just about making things more fun. They were often about ensuring robust offspring and satisfying marital duties. You could say they were the medieval equivalent of a very odd date night menu with a side of questionable science. Consider the rather unappetizing ingredients that were believed to fire up passion. The consumption of sparrow brains was a popular suggestion, as sparrows were observed to be particularly amorous birds. Or perhaps you'd fancy some powdered mandrake root, a plant shrouded in myth and associated with powerful, often magical, properties. Then there were the more bodily fluids. Some recipes called for consuming mixtures containing semen from animals, thankfully, or so we hope, believed to transfer virility directly. Others suggested blood, particularly from animals known for their strength or vitality. It's enough to make you lose your appetite, let alone your inhibitions. One can almost picture a medieval cook with a grimace, preparing a love potion that smelled suspiciously like barnyard. These were desperate measures for a time when having children, especially male heirs, was paramount, and lack of desire could be a serious social and marital issue. Moving beyond ingestibles, there were also external applications and rituals. One rather bizarre method involved carrying certain parts of animals. For instance, wearing the dried liver of a pigeon or the bone from the right wing of a bat was thought to enhance potency or attractiveness. And while we're talking about external applications, some texts recommend rubbing specific oils or salves on the body, though the ingredients for these were often just as strange, incorporating animal fats and various herbs. The effectiveness, or rather the lack thereof, of these methods provides a fascinating insight into the prevailing medical and magical beliefs of the era. The open scholarly debate surrounding these concoctions often questions whether any perceived success was due to physiological effects or simply the potent power of the placebo effect. It's easy to chuckle at these practices, but they reveal a profound human longing for control over their bodies and desires, and a deep reliance on the natural world and its perceived mystical properties. The medieval mind saw connections with no longer do, attributing power to creatures and plants based on their appearance, behavior, or even just ancient folklore. The pursuit of aphrodisiacs wasn't just about recreation. It was about health, fertility, and societal expectation. You might wonder if anyone ever actually enjoyed these concoctions. It's safe to say that while they aimed for physical arousal, they probably achieved more gag reflexes than glorious romantic evenings. But hey, when your options are limited, even sparrow brains might look appealing. Maybe the boundary between medicine and magic was incredibly fluid then, meaning people were willing to try almost anything if it promised to fulfill a deep-seated need, especially when it came to ensuring the continuation of their lineage. We've explored the complexities of medieval marriage and the grim realities of constantly seeking fertility or struggling with its absence. Now let's turn our gaze to another facet of medieval sexuality, one that existed on the fringes of acceptable society yet was undeniably present: brothels. You might assume that such establishments were entirely hidden, operating in deep shadow. However, a mainstream historical fact is that while the Church condemned prostitution as a grave sin, many medieval towns and cities paradoxically tolerated, regulated, and sometimes even profited from it. It was a classic case of civic pragmatism, clashing quite directly with religious ideals. You see, urban authorities often viewed brothels as a necessary evil, a way to contain and manage what they considered an unavoidable human urge. Thereby they hoped protecting respectable women from assault and maintaining a semblance of public order. Picture a bustling medieval street, perhaps narrower and far dirtier than you're imagining. Tucked away, often in specific districts, or on the very outskirts of town, you'd find these establishments. They weren't always the dimly lit, clandestine dens you might envision from modern movies. In some cities, particularly later in the period around the 14th and 15th centuries, brothels could be surprisingly official. You might even discover public brothels, sometimes owned or licensed directly by the city council itself. This rather bizarre arrangement meant that the very same authorities who enforced strict moral codes and paid lip service to Christian doctrine were simultaneously collecting taxes from the very institutions they ostensibly condemned. It's like a medieval city council saying, "We don't approve of this behavior, but if you're going to do it anyway, we might as well make a few pennies from it." This official tolerance, however, rarely translated into protection or respect. For the women working within them, the life of a medieval prostitute was, by any measure, incredibly harsh. They faced immense social stigma, even if their existence was tolerated by the authorities. They were often actively excluded from many aspects of community life, barred from attending certain churches or gaining membership in influential guilds. Their legal rights were severely limited, and they were profoundly vulnerable to exploitation, violence, and the rampant spread of disease. You might find city ordinances dictating what they could wear, often distinctive clothing like striped hoods or specific colors to publicly mark them out, or where they could live, ensuring they remained segregated in their designated districts. This wasn't about empowering women or providing them a safe space. It was almost entirely about control and containment, making sure they didn't corrupt the wider populace. One particularly peculiar aspect Adding to the strange nature of these places is the occasional evidence of rudimentary medical inspection in larger, more regulated brothels, especially concerning venereal diseases. While incredibly basic by modern standards, such as simply examining a person, it highlights a grudging, pragmatic acknowledgement of public health concerns. You can almost imagine a weary city official, armed with little more than common sense, and a fervent prayer, attempting to manage an outbreak in a district teeming with people. The open scholarly debate surrounding the effectiveness of such measures is ongoing, with many questioning their actual impact, but their very existence points to a surprisingly pragmatic, if deeply flawed, attempt to deal with the messy realities of urban life and public health. So, while the bells of the cathedral called devout citizens to prayer, just a few streets away, another kind of transaction was taking place, under the watchful, if profoundly conflicted, eye of the medieval authorities. It was a stark reminder that even in an age dominated by faith, human nature, and indeed human hypocrisy, always found a way to manifest. Having navigated the expansive and terrifying concept of sodomy, let's now turn our attention to those who, by their very vows, were meant to transcend worldly desires. The clergy, you see, a fundamental pillar of the medieval church, particularly for monks, nuns, and increasingly for priests, was celibacy. This was, in theory, a commitment to a life without marriage or sexual relations, dedicated solely to God. However, the reality, as often happens with human nature, was far messier than the ideal. Clerical celibacy, while a strong expectation, was often observed more in the breach than in practice, leading to numerous scandals and a constant struggle for ecclesiastical authorities. The Church had long wrestled with the issue of clerical marriage and concubinage, while celibacy was a growing ideal from the early Middle Ages. It wasn't universally enforced or even practiced in all regions for centuries. By the High Middle Ages, however, the expectation of celibacy for priests became much stronger, particularly after the Gregorian reforms of the 11th century, which aimed to purify the Church. Yet, despite these strong pronouncements from Rome and local bishops, many priests had wives or concubines, and children were not uncommon. You might stumble upon a village priest who lived openly with a woman, perhaps even raising a family, with the tacit approval of his parishioners, who valued his spiritual guidance and presence more than his adherence to a distant, often impractical, rule. It was a peculiar double standard, a public face of piety, often masking a very private and quite human reality. These relationships, though technically illicit, weren't always conducted in deep secret. Sometimes, these wives or concubines would even be referred to as priestesses or presbyteresses in local parlance, a telling sign of community acceptance and the normalized disregard for the celibacy rule at a grassroots level. The children born of such unions sometimes faced social stigma and legal disadvantages, particularly if they wished to inherit church property, but they were nonetheless part of the social fabric. A mainstream historical fact is that this widespread practice of clerical concubinage and marriage was a persistent thorn in the side of reformers, enduring for centuries despite repeated prohibitions. It truly highlights the immense difficulty the Church faced in imposing such a stringent rule on its vast ranks across diverse regions and cultures. It's like trying to herd cats, but the cats are also human beings with desires and needs, and some of them are quite powerful figures within their local communities. The open scholarly debate regarding these celibacy reforms often centers on their actual effectiveness and the extent to which they were truly implemented at a grassroots level. Records from church councils, episcopal visitations, when a bishop visited parishes to check on his clergy, and even satirical literature provide fascinating, if sometimes exaggerated, glimpses into the widespread nature of clerical lapses. These documents reveal bishops constantly struggling to enforce the rule, issuing endless decrees against priests who kept women in their homes. Some priests even attempted to pass off their partners as housekeepers or sisters, a transparent ruse that fooled very few, especially when multiple children were involved. It was a perpetual game of hide-and-seek between ecclesiastical authority and human nature, and for much of the medieval period, human nature seemed to be winning, or at least holding its own quite comfortably. So, while you might imagine the medieval clergy as austere and entirely detached from worldly pleasures, many were, in fact, living lives far more intertwined with the carnal and domestic than their vows would suggest. We've explored the complexities of medieval marriage and the grim realities of regulated brothels. Now, let's wade into a term that, in the medieval mind, encompassed a startling breadth of sexual transgressions: sodomy. You might think of sodomy strictly in terms of modern definitions, perhaps exclusively referring to specific sexual acts between individuals of the same sex. However, for medieval theologians and legal scholars, this word cast a far wider net, stretching to capture almost any non-procreative sexual act. It wasn't just about certain positions or same-sex relations. It was about any sexual activity deemed against nature or, crucially, against the divine purpose of procreation. If it couldn't potentially make a baby, it was probably suspect. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scope of this condemnation. While same-sex acts were certainly included and heavily condemned, the definition of sodomy could also encompass masturbation, oral sex, anal sex, even within heterosexual marriage, and even intercourse during forbidden times like Lent or Sundays, as we touched upon earlier. Basically, if it didn't directly lead to the possibility of conception, it risked falling under this terrifying umbrella. The severity of the punishment for sodomy varied wildly by region and by period, but it could range from public humiliation and fines to imprisonment, castration, or even execution, often by burning at the stake. You can almost feel the chill of fear that such a broad and unforgiving definition would cast over people's private lives. It's a stark reminder that what was considered deviant then bears little resemblance to our contemporary understanding of sexual morality. The perceived link between sodomy and heresy was particularly potent and dangerous. If you were accused of sodomy, it wasn't just a sexual sin against God's law. It could be interpreted as a defiance of divine order, a rejection of God's very plan for humanity. This made it an especially dangerous accusation, often strategically leveled against groups or individuals deemed undesirable for other reasons, too. For example, a mainstream historical fact is that accusations of sodomy were sometimes used as a tool to discredit perceived enemies or to suppress powerful groups. Like the Knights Templar, adding a layer of moral condemnation to underlying political or economic motives. It's like a medieval smear campaign, but one with much more dire and physically brutal consequences for the accused. One fascinating aspect of this concept is how its interpretation and enforcement evolved. Early medieval interpretations of sodomy were often less precise than later ones, which became increasingly detailed and severe, especially after the 12th century. The nuanced academic discussions among scholars frequently point to how the concept of sodomy was less about a fixed, immutable set of acts, and more about a flexible theological and legal tool used by authorities to control and define sexual morality within a Christian framework. It reflects a society grappling with its understanding of the human body, innate desires, and divine will, often through the lens of fear, control, and harsh condemnation. So, while we might categorize specific acts today, the medieval mind saw a vast, interconnected web of unnatural behaviors, all equally liable to incur divine wrath and severe earthly punishment. It really makes you wonder how anyone managed to relax in the bedroom, knowing such broad definitions were looming over their intimate lives. We've glimpsed the challenges faced by the clergy in upholding their vows, revealing a fascinating tension between ideal and reality. Now, let's consider how the Church, for all its struggles with internal celibacy, exerted immense influence over the sexual lives of ordinary people. This brings us directly to the confessional, that sacred, often dimly lit space where sins were unburdened and penance was assigned. A core tenet of medieval Catholicism was the belief in the sacrament of penance, requiring regular confession of sins to a priest to receive absolution for the soul. And, as you might guess, sexual transgressions featured very prominently in these intimate exchanges. You had to lay bare your soul, and sometimes your most private desires, to a man who was, theoretically, a spiritual guide, but also a representative of divine law. Think of yourself kneeling before the priest, perhaps hidden by a screen or simply face to face in the church nave, the hushed atmosphere amplifying every whispered word. He wasn't just passively listening, he was often actively questioning you. The penitentials, those incredibly detailed books we've mentioned before, served as a comprehensive guide for confessors, providing an exhaustive list of sins and the appropriate questions to elicit their full disclosure. This meant that the confessional became a surprisingly detailed, if one-sided, record of medieval sexual practices, revealing a spectrum of behaviors that went far beyond simple fornication or adultery. It was here that the quirky details of medieval sexuality often came to light, as individuals confessed their most unusual or explicitly forbidden acts. For instance, a confessor might probe deeply into the specifics of marital intimacy, asking about forbidden sexual positions. They might inquire if the penitent had engaged in the English vice, a known euphemism for anal sex, though it wasn't exclusively English, or the German vice, oral sex. They might question the use of objects during sex, or more broadly, if any acts were performed that deliberately prevented conception, which, as you know, was a major sin. The focus was always rigidly on the natural order, sex solely for procreation within the confines of marriage. Any deviation from this, even within marital bounds, was considered a sin requiring penance. It's almost as if the Church had a comprehensive checklist for your bedroom activities, and woe betide you if you ticked the wrong box. The level of detail could be astonishingly precise, sometimes making you wonder if the confessors were more concerned with comprehensive sin than actual spiritual guidance, or if they were, perhaps, a little too interested in the nitty-gritty details themselves. A mainstream historical fact is that the confessional, particularly after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated annual confession, became a powerful tool for social control and the dissemination of moral norms. The records derived from confessional manuals, while not verbatim transcripts of actual confessions, offer an unparalleled window into what was perceived as sinful, and thus, what was likely practiced by at least some segments of the population. These texts reveal concerns about practices like onanism, interpreted broadly to include withdrawal or any emission of semen not leading to conception. Beastiality, which we will delve into in more detail soon, if you can believe it, and even impure thoughts or dreams that led to involuntary emissions. The open scholarly debate surrounding these confessional sources often questions how accurate a reflection they are of widespread everyday behavior. Were people truly engaging in all these specific acts, or were confessors simply casting a wide net to ensure no potential sin went unmentioned, perhaps even inadvertently suggesting ideas to their penitents? Regardless, the sheer volume and specificity of these questions suggest that medieval people were just as varied and, shall we say, imaginative in their sexual lives as any other generation. Despite the looming shadow of the Church's ever-watchful eye, it must have been quite the conversation starter, if not exactly a comfortable one. We've explored the detailed and sometimes alarming reach of the confessional into medieval bedrooms. Now, let's confront a truly unsettling and disturbing aspect of medieval sexual anxieties: bestiality. While the very idea is repugnant to modern sensibilities, medieval society, influenced by both religious texts and prevailing superstitions, grappled with the concept of humans engaging in sexual acts with animals. It was considered an extreme transgression, a profound violation of the natural order, and a sin that often carried the gravest of punishments. Consider the prevailing worldview, where the line between humanity and the animal kingdom was firmly drawn by divine creation. To cross that line sexually was not just a sin. It was often viewed as a form of demonic influence or even witchcraft. A mainstream historical fact is that bestiality was frequently condemned in both canon church law and secular law, often with the same severity as heresy or sodomy. The punishments could be horrific, ranging from public burning to strangulation or decapitation, sometimes with the animal involved also being executed as if it too were a guilty party. You can almost feel the collective horror and moral panic that such an act would incite within a medieval community, seeing it as an affront to God and a direct path to chaos. The belief that such acts occurred wasn't just a theological construct. Actual accusations and trials, though rare, are documented in legal records across Europe. These cases, often arising in rural areas where humans and animals lived in close proximity and daily life was intertwined, highlight the deep fears and anxieties of the time. The details, when they emerged, would have sent shivers down the spines of the populace, reinforcing the belief in demonic temptation and the constant battle against the forces of evil. It's important to note that the very concept of bestiality could also be interpreted broadly by authorities, sometimes encompassing more than just direct sexual acts. For instance, in some instances, it could be tied to fantastical notions of incubi and succubi, demons believed to have sexual intercourse with humans in their sleep, sometimes appearing in animalistic forms to deceive or torment. So, a sexually charged nightmare could, in the medieval mind, become an accusation of a truly horrific sin against nature. The complexity of these beliefs reveals itself when you consider the nuances in medieval thought. Some scholastic texts even debated the degree of culpability of the human participant, depending on whether the act was coerced by a demon or engaged involuntarily. The open scholarly debate among historians around these historical accounts often focuses on whether these accusations reflected actual widespread practices, or were more a manifestation of societal fears, moral panics, or even deliberate fabrications, used to discredit individuals who were already marginalized or disliked. Regardless, The persistent mention of bestiality in legal codes, confessional manuals, and theological treatises underscores its profound symbolic power as the ultimate unnatural act, pushing the boundaries of what was considered human and divine in the medieval world. It stands as a chilling testament to the medieval obsession with order, both natural and supernatural, and the terrifying consequences of straying from it. It's truly a dark corner of the past, thankfully largely confined to history. From the chilling depths of bestiality, let's now pivot to another complex and often misunderstood taboo of the medieval era: incest. You might think the rules around incest are universally clear, but in the Middle Ages, particularly concerning marriage, the concept was far more intricate and, frankly, baffling than you'd expect. A mainstream historical fact is that the Church's prohibitions against incest extended far beyond direct blood relatives, encompassing a vast network of relationships through marriage, godparentage, and even sexual relations. This created a bewildering web of forbidden unions. Imagine a large, interconnected family network in a medieval village or aristocratic lineage. You weren't just forbidden from marrying your sister or your first cousin. Oh no. The Church's rules on consanguinity, blood relationship, and affinity relationship through marriage stretched to 7 degrees of kinship, meaning you couldn't marry someone if you shared a great dash, great dash, great dash, great dash, great dash grandparent, or if your spouse's third cousin was also your second cousin. It was like a medieval game of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, but with severe spiritual and legal consequences if you connected the wrong people. This was particularly challenging for noble families who, due to limited social circles and a desire to consolidate power and wealth, often married within a relatively small pool of aristocratic lines. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation from medieval matchmakers trying to navigate this incredibly complex family tree, desperately searching for a partner who wasn't somehow related to everyone else. The complexity didn't stop there. The concept of spiritual kinship through God also created marital impediments. If you were godparents to the same child, or if you were a godparent to your future spouse's child, that created a spiritual bond that made marriage forbidden. It's a truly peculiar tidbit that reflects the profound importance of spiritual ties in medieval society, elevating them to a level comparable to blood relations when it came to marital eligibility. This meant that a simple act of devotion, like sponsoring a child's baptism, could unexpectedly block a future marriage proposal. Talk about an unexpected complication for your social life. The open, scholarly debate around these expansive incest prohibitions often questions their underlying motivations, while certainly rooted in moral and theological concerns about the purity of lineage and the avoidance of sin. Some historians suggest these rules also served a pragmatic purpose for the Church. The broader the definition of incest, the more marriages the Church could declare invalid, and consequently, the more power it wielded through granting dispensations, special permissions to marry despite a prohibition or annulling existing unions. This gave the Church significant leverage over powerful families, who might need a papal dispensation to marry an advantageous match if they discovered a distant, prohibited kinship. So, while on the surface it was about upholding moral order, beneath that lay a clever mechanism for extending ecclesiastical influence. The medieval legal landscape of marriage was less about simple family lines and more about a dizzying, divine-mandated labyrinth. Having navigated the dizzying complexities of medieval incest laws, let's now turn our attention to another desperate attempt to control matters of the heart and body: Love potions. You see, in a world where arranged marriages were common, and genuine affection wasn't always the starting point of a union, the desire to win someone's love or to reignite a dwindling passion was incredibly strong. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval people, lacking scientific understanding of chemistry or psychology, often turned to magic and folk remedies in the belief that they could manipulate emotions and sexual desire. These weren't just harmless romantic gestures. These were often dangerous concoctions, sometimes literally lethal brews. Imagine someone consumed by unrequited love, or a spouse desperate to secure their partner's fidelity. Where would they turn? To the local cunning folk, the wise woman, or perhaps a traveling charlatan promising miraculous results. The ingredients for these so-called love potions were incredibly varied and often utterly grotesque by modern standards. You might find recipes calling for powdered bones, menstrual blood, animal parts, remember that crocodile dung sunscreen. This is similar, but for internal use, or even human bodily fluids. These were often mixed with herbs, whispered incantations, and then surreptitiously administered to the unsuspecting target, perhaps slipped into their food or drink. It's the kind of thing that makes you want to thoroughly scrutinize every meal you were offered in the Middle Ages. Oh, this soup tastes metallic and hairy. Is this love, or just a bad stew? The methods of application were just as varied and peculiar. Some potions were meant to be drunk, others to be applied to the skin, or even sprinkled on a person's clothes or bedding. There was a particular belief in the power of sympathetic magic, where a material associated with a person or a desired outcome could be used to influence them. So, if you wanted someone to love you, you might try to obtain a lock of their hair or a piece of their clothing to incorporate into your spell or potion. The outcomes, of course, were wildly unpredictable. At best, they did nothing. At worst, given the toxic ingredients, they could cause severe illness, disfigurement, or even death. This dark side of love potions underscores the desperation people felt. The open scholarly debate surrounding love potions often centers on their actual prevalence and the societal response to them. Were they a common practice, or were they more sensationalized in moralistic texts and court records? Regardless, the Church vehemently condemned such practices, viewing them as a form of witchcraft and a direct attempt to usurp God's will. To force love through magic was seen as a grave sin, often punishable by severe penance or even legal action if harm came to the victim. It highlights a recurring theme in medieval life, the human desire for control over unpredictable forces, whether it be disease, fertility, or love itself. So, while the Romantic poets sang of courtly love, a darker, more dangerous undercurrent of magical manipulation flowed through the shadows, promising affection but often delivering only sickness or despair. From the perilous world of love potions, let's now confront a far grimmer and more pervasive reality of medieval life: sexual assault. You see, while we've been exploring the bizarre and sometimes humorous aspects of medieval sexuality, it's crucial to acknowledge the dark underbelly of power, imbalances, and the stark realities faced by many. A mainstream historical fact is that sexual assault was a disturbingly common crime in the Middle Ages, and legal protections for victims were often woefully inadequate, leaving many vulnerable and without recourse. Imagine the precarious position of women, particularly those from lower social classes, or those who found themselves without male protectors. Society was rigidly hierarchical, and power was concentrated in the hands of a few. While legal codes technically existed to punish rape, the burden of proof often fell heavily on the victim. She might have to produce witnesses, or even undergo a public examination to prove her claim. The process was humiliating and daunting, often deterring victims from coming forward. Furthermore, the concept of consent, as we understand it today, was nascent at best. Resistance was often expected, and failure to resist sufficiently could be interpreted as tacit agreement, a truly horrific legal loophole for perpetrators. You can almost feel the chilling injustice of a system designed to protect property and lineage more than the bodily autonomy of individuals. The legal penalties for sexual assault varied widely across different regions and time periods, but they were often inconsistent and lenient for the perpetrator, especially if he was of a higher social standing. Fines, rather than severe corporal punishment or imprisonment, were common, effectively putting a price on a woman's body and honor. In some cases, the perpetrator might be forced to marry the victim, a bizarre and profoundly problematic solution that compounded the trauma by forcing the assaulted woman into a lifelong union with her attacker. It was less about justice for the victim and more about restoring the family's honor or preventing the birth of an illegitimate child. One particularly grim aspect, a stark and unsettling detail, is the frequent occurrence of abduction and forced marriage, often following an assault among the nobility. While sometimes presented in romantic tales as elopement, in reality, it was often a violent act of seizing a woman, usually for her inheritance or political connections, and then forcing her into marriage, sometimes after having already assaulted her, to compromise her and make her unmarriageable to anyone else. The open scholarly debate surrounding these practices often grapples with the difficulty of assessing the true prevalence of sexual violence from fragmented historical records. Many assaults undoubtedly went unreported or unpunished, swallowed by the prevailing societal norms and the victim's fear of further humiliation or reprisal. This dark reality stands as a stark contrast to any romanticized notions of chivalry, reminding us that medieval society, for all its complexities, could be a profoundly dangerous and unjust place, particularly for those with less power. It's a somber chapter in our journey, but one that is essential to acknowledge for a full understanding of the era. Having confronted the grim realities of sexual assault, let's pivot to a different, perhaps more earthy and communal aspect of medieval life. Though one still deeply rooted in procreation and survival, fertility rites and rustic revelry. You see, in a society heavily reliant on agriculture, where the success of crops meant the difference between life and death, the fertility of the land and the fertility of the people were often seen as deeply intertwined. These weren't just about human babies. They were about the very abundance of life itself. Consider the rhythm of the medieval agricultural year, dictated by sowing and harvesting, by the turning of the seasons. Many folk traditions, some pre-Christian in origin, persisted alongside Christian observances, blending into a unique tapestry of beliefs. A profound historical fact is that various pagan fertility rituals were adapted and continued throughout the Middle Ages, often disguised or reinterpreted with a thin veneer of Christian approval. You would find communities engaging in boisterous festivals, often during springtime or around harvest, explicitly aimed at encouraging fecundity in the fields, in the livestock, and implicitly in the villagers themselves. These were moments when the usual strictures loosened, and the raw energy of life was celebrated. These festivals could involve incredibly suggestive even explicit, actions. For example, during certain spring celebrations, people might dance around maypoles, which, with their upright phallic symbolism, were clear representations of fertility. There might be mock marriages between figures representing the earth, god, and goddess, or exaggerated performances of sexual acts in plays or folk dances. The line between symbolic fertility and actual licentious behavior could become very blurry indeed. It's almost as if the entire village was saying, "Please, Mother Nature, give us a good harvest. And here's a rather suggestive dance to help you get the idea." The atmosphere would be one of uninhibited revelry, a stark contrast to the usual pious demeanor of daily life. One particularly striking detail of these revelries involved fertility dolls or effigies, sometimes made of straw or cloth, which would be carried in processions, blessed, or even ritually married to encourage abundance. These were not just abstract symbols. They were physical representations of the life force the community hoped to tap into. The communal nature of these rites is especially interesting. They were shared acts, binding the community together in a common cause, with everyone participating, in the hope of ensuring prosperity for all. The ongoing academic discussion surrounding these rituals often questions the extent to which they were conscious fertility rites versus simply boisterous celebrations that happened to have elements interpreted as such. Nevertheless, their persistent presence underscores the deep-seated human connection to the land and the primal urge to ensure the continuation of life, even if it involved some rather unchristian displays of abandon. It was a time when the sacred and the profane danced a surprisingly intimate jig, all in the service of survival. From the boisterous energy of fertility rites, let's transition to something seemingly more mundane, yet equally revealing about medieval sexual dynamics: sumptuary laws. You see, medieval society was obsessed with order and hierarchy, and nowhere was this more evident than in clothing. These laws dictated what people could wear based on their social status, wealth, and even profession. However, beneath this rigid sartorial control, clothing also became a surprising medium for secret signals, including those related to sexual intent. Consider the meticulous detail of these laws. A profound historical fact is that sumptuary laws were enacted across medieval Europe, prescribing everything from the type of fabric, the colors, the amount of trim, and even the length of a shoe's pointed toe. A commoner, for instance, might be forbidden from wearing silk or ermine fur, materials reserved for the nobility. The intent was clear: to maintain visible distinctions between social classes and prevent ambitious individuals from dressing above their station. You can almost hear the exasperated sighs of a medieval fashionista, longing for a splash of forbidden color. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite the laws, people are remarkably ingenious at finding loopholes and subtle ways to express themselves, or indeed to express other things. While a woman of certain standing might be restricted in the type of fabric she wore, she could still manipulate other elements to send a message. Clothing, therefore, became a medium for covert communication, sometimes hinting at illicit encounters or availability. For example, a woman might wear her veil in a particular, slightly askew fashion, or choose a specific, subtly immodest cut to her gown within the bounds of what was technically permissible, but pushing the envelope, sending a signal to a potential lover that went unnoticed by the casual observer but was perfectly clear to those in the know. It was like a medieval secret code woven into the very fabric of society. This subtle defiance extended to accessories, a particular type of belt, a specific jewel, or even the way a cloak was draped could convey messages that transcended the written law. These weren't necessarily scandalous overtures, but rather invitations, hints, or acknowledgments of mutual interest that bypassed the explicit verbal communication often impossible in a highly structured society. The open scholarly debate concerning sumptuary laws often explores this dual function. Were they truly effective in controlling behavior, or did they inadvertently foster a more complex, nuanced system of hidden signals? The irony, of course, is that by attempting to control outward appearance so rigidly, medieval authorities perhaps pushed desire and flirtation into more creative, subtle, and perhaps even more intriguing forms of expression. It's a testament to human ingenuity that even under strict regulations, people find a way to communicate their desires, sometimes right under the nose of authority. From the subtle signals of sumptuary laws, we now transition to a far less subtle, indeed often brutally overt, aspect of medieval life: public punishments for private pleasures. You see, while illicit sexual acts certainly occurred behind closed doors when they were discovered, the consequences could be shockingly public and profoundly humiliating. Society's desire to control morality often manifested in spectacular displays designed to shame offenders and deter others. Consider the spectacle of medieval justice. A profound historical fact is that public shaming was a common form of punishment for sexual transgressions, far more prevalent than lengthy imprisonment for many minor offenses. If you were caught in an act of fornication, adultery, or even keeping a concubine, especially if you were a priest, as we discussed earlier, you might find yourself subjected to a humiliating display that served as both punishment and moral lesson for the entire community. This wasn't about quiet contemplation of your sins. It was about loud, visible disgrace. One particularly common method of public shaming involved the pillory or the stocks. You would be placed in a wooden device that trapped your head and hands, or feet for the stocks, leaving you exposed to the elements and the jeers of the crowd. People might throw rotten vegetables, mud, or even worse at you, all while shouting insults and accusations. For sexual offenses, a sign detailing your specific transgression might be hung around your neck, ensuring everyone knew exactly what you had done. It's the kind of public performance that would make any modern reality TV show seem tame by comparison. The goal was to destroy your reputation, making it difficult for you to live a normal life within that community afterward. The emotional scars would likely last far longer than any physical ones. Beyond the pillory, other forms of public humiliation were tailored to the specific offense. A woman caught in adultery might have her hair cut short or her head shaven, a deeply shaming act in a society where a woman's long hair was often seen as a mark of beauty and modesty. In some towns, offenders might be forced to wear distinctive, ridiculous clothing or parade through the streets with signs declaring their sins. A particularly graphic example involved public whipping, sometimes through the streets, for repeat offenders or more severe cases. The physical pain was secondary to the excruciating public exposure. The collective experience of witnessing such punishments was intended to reinforce moral boundaries and instill fear of straying from them. It was a potent form of social control, aimed squarely at keeping desires in check. The various ways communities devised to expose and punish private misdeeds reveal a fascinating tension in medieval society. On one hand, there was a deeply embedded belief in Christian morality and the importance of chastity and marital fidelity. On the other hand, there was a pragmatic understanding that human desire was powerful and often difficult to contain. The harshness of the public spectacle suggests a society constantly grappling with its own moral shortcomings and attempting to enforce an ideal through fear. The open scholarly debate surrounding these punishments often explores their true effectiveness. Did they genuinely deter future offenses, or did they merely drive illicit behavior further underground? Regardless, these public spectacles served as powerful visual sermons, etching a clear message into the minds of all who witnessed them. Stray from the path of righteousness at your peril, for your private pleasures could become very public pain. It's a stark reminder that in the Middle Ages, the community's gaze was a powerful and often punitive force. From the public humiliation of the pillory, we now delve into an even darker, more terrifying intersection of medieval fear and sexuality, witchcraft and wantonness. You see, in a world grappling with natural disasters, disease, and unexplained misfortunes, the concept of witchcraft offered a powerful, albeit terrifying, explanation. And crucially, accusations of witchcraft often became inextricably linked with accusations of deviant sexual behavior, particularly concerning women. Consider the prevailing fear of the supernatural. A profound historical fact is that the late medieval period, especially from the 14th century onwards, saw a significant rise in the persecution of alleged witches across Europe. This wasn't just about harmless folk magic. It evolved into a terrifying hunt for individuals believed to be in league with the devil, capable of inflicting harm through malevolent magic. And what was one of the devil's primary tools? Temptation, particularly sexual temptation. You can almost feel the chill wind of paranoia sweeping through communities, turning neighbor against neighbor, especially when unexplained ailments or crop failures struck. The link between witchcraft and sexuality was deeply embedded in theological and popular beliefs. Women, in particular, were often seen as more susceptible to the devil's temptations due to perceived weaknesses of the flesh. Accusations frequently included claims of sexual intercourse with demons such as incubi and succubi, which we briefly touched upon earlier, or even engaging in orgiastic rites at a witch's sabbath, a fantastical gathering where unholy sexual acts were supposedly performed. These narratives, often extracted under torture, painted a terrifying picture of unbridled lust and depravity, a complete inversion of Christian morality. It was as if the very idea of female sexual agency, outside the strict confines of marriage and procreation, was so unsettling that it had to be demonized and attributed to infernal forces. The legal and theological treatises on witchcraft, like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, The Witch's Hammer, published in 1487, explicitly detailed the sexual nature of witchcraft, emphasizing the devil's insatiable desire and the witch's willing participation. This text, intended as a guide for witch hunters, meticulously laid out how witches supposedly copulated with demons, describing the coldness of the demonic semen and the unholy pleasure derived from such acts. These grotesque descriptions, absorbed by fearful populations, fueled the moral panic and justified the brutal persecutions. The open scholarly discussion surrounding the witch hunts often highlights the role of misogyny and societal anxieties about female power and sexuality in driving these persecutions. Were these confessions genuinely reflecting actual practices, or were they the product of intense pressure, leading accused individuals to confess to wild fantasies presented to them by their interrogators? Regardless, the terrifying confluence of sexual deviance and demonic pacts led to unimaginable suffering and death for countless individuals, predominantly women. It's a somber and horrifying chapter, demonstrating how deeply ingrained sexual fear could become in the medieval mind, reaching even the most innocent and vulnerable members of society. From the chilling grip of witch hunts and their twisted sexual accusations, let's pivot to a seemingly contradictory realm: holy relics and hidden desires. You see, in medieval Europe, relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of their clothing, or objects they touched, were revered as powerful conduits to the divine. Pilgrimages to shrines housing these relics were commonplace, undertaken for healing, forgiveness, or spiritual comfort. Yet, alongside these pious intentions, there sometimes existed a fascinating, almost bizarre, association between these sacred objects and deeply earthly concerns, including fertility and sexual healing. Consider the immense spiritual power attributed to these relics. A profound historical fact is that the cult of saints and their relics was a cornerstone of medieval religious practice. Churches competed fiercely to acquire the most prestigious relics, believing they brought divine favor and attracted pilgrims, thus boosting both spiritual prestige and economic prosperity for the local community. You would find entire towns built around a saint's shrine, teeming with pilgrims seeking miracles. The belief was that a saint, being close to God, could intercede on behalf of the faithful, and their earthly remains or possessions retained a piece of that divine connection. Now, here's where the peculiar intertwining with human desires comes in. While many sought cures for physical ailments or spiritual guidance, a significant number of pilgrims also sought help for very personal and often unspoken issues, including infertility or problems related to sexual dysfunction. For a couple struggling to conceive, or an individual suffering from an ailment impacting their physical intimacy, turning to a powerful saint's relic for a miracle was a desperate yet logical step within their worldview. The hope was that the saint's divine power could somehow rebalance the body, encourage conception, or restore potency. It was almost as if certain saints had a special, heavenly department for reproductive health. One striking example, though not a specific relic, but a related phenomenon, involved fertility shrines, or specific wells, or natural formations that became associated with a saint or a miraculous healing. People would visit these places, perform rituals, and pray for assistance with conception. This practice highlights the blend of Christian devotion with older, pre-Christian fertility customs, demonstrating how popular belief could reshape religious practices to meet very tangible human needs. The academic discussion surrounding these practices often explores the tension between official church doctrine, which might frown upon such direct, almost magical, use of relics for earthly desires, and the enduring folk piety that embraced it. Was this a corruption of faith, or simply an adaptation of spiritual power to address the fundamental human concerns of life and lineage? Regardless, it reveals a fascinating dimension of medieval religiosity, where even the most sacred objects could be approached with hopes that extended beyond the purely spiritual, touching upon the deeply intimate realm of human desire and procreation. It's a subtle reminder that even in an age of profound faith, the earthly needs of the body and the yearning for children remained powerfully present. From the sacred aura of holy relics and their surprising connection to fertility, let's now move to a concept that, at first glance, seems utterly romantic and ethereal: courtly love. You've probably encountered this in tales of knights, ladies, and chivalrous deeds, with knights dedicating their valor to an unattainable, idealized woman. However, a mainstream historical fact is that courtly love was a highly stylized and often non-consummated form of romantic admiration, primarily a literary convention that profoundly influenced medieval aristocratic culture, but also presented fascinating, often contradictory, ideas about desire and intimacy. Consider the typical scenario. A brave knight falls hopelessly in love with a married noblewoman, often his lord's wife. Their love is passionate, intense, yet typically remains unfulfilled in a physical sense. The knight performs daring feats, writes poetry, and endures great suffering, all to win a mere glance or a favor from his lady. His devotion refines him, making him more courteous, brave, and virtuous. It's an intricate game, played out in the courts of Eleanor of Aquitaine or Marie de Champagne, emphasizing purity of intention over physical gratification. You can almost see the knights polishing their armor, not just for battle, but for a chance to impress their distant, idealized love. The rules of this game were complex and often paradoxical. For instance, according to some treatises on courtly love, true love could only exist outside of marriage, because marriage was a practical arrangement, often devoid of genuine affection. This peculiar tidbit suggests a societal acknowledgement that passion and matrimony were often separate entities. Love within marriage was considered a different, perhaps lesser form of affection, focused on companionship and procreation. Meanwhile, courtly love, with its inherent obstacles and unfulfilled longing, was seen as a nobler, purer, and more intense form of devotion. It's like having two separate emotional filing cabinets, one for your spouse, and one for your poetic, unattainable crush. The open scholarly debate regarding courtly love often centers on the extent to which it was merely a literary construct, confined to poems and romances, versus a lived social practice. Did knights and ladies genuinely engage in these elaborate, non-physical relationships, or was it simply a fashionable literary trope? Regardless, its immense cultural impact is undeniable. It introduced new vocabulary for discussing emotions, refined manners, and idealized the role of women, albeit often as objects of adoration rather than autonomous individuals. While it wasn't about bizarre sexual practices in the crude sense, its very essence, a highly passionate yet often unconsummated desire, was a profoundly strange and influential approach to intimacy. It set up an ideal of love that transcended the physical, but ironically, was entirely born from the very human capacity for intense, albeit frustrated, desire. From the idealized and often unconsummated passions of courtly love, let's now shift our gaze to a much more earthy and communal setting, the bathhouses. You might associate medieval bathing with rare, rather unpleasant experiences, but in many urban centers, public bathhouses were bustling hubs of social activity, often serving purposes far beyond mere cleanliness, including surprising connections to sexual interactions. Consider the daily life in a medieval town. Most homes lacked private bathing facilities, making public baths a necessity for hygiene, especially in larger cities. A profound historical fact is that public bathhouses were common across medieval Europe, inherited from Roman traditions, and persisted in many forms until the early modern period. They were places where people gathered to wash, yes, but also to socialize, relax, and conduct business. You would find people from various social strata, though often segregated by gender or by specific hours, coming together in a surprisingly intimate, steamy environment. But here's where the beyond cleanliness aspect comes into play. These bathhouses, while ostensibly about hygiene, also developed a reputation, sometimes justified, as places where sexual encounters could occur. The communal nature, the relaxed atmosphere, and the very act of disrobing could, inevitably, lead to more than just scrubbing. In some cities, bathhouses became known as places of assignation, or even functioned as thinly veiled brothels. It's almost as if the steam itself created an atmosphere where inhibitions could loosen, and opportunities for illicit liaisons arose. You can almost hear the whispered invitations over the splashing of water and the murmuring of conversations. The regulation of these bathhouses varied widely. Some municipalities tried to control their more scandalous aspects, perhaps by prohibiting women of ill repute, or by strictly enforcing gender segregation. Others seemed to turn a blind eye, tacitly acknowledging their dual function. The presence of barbers, masseurs, and even food and drink vendors in these establishments only added to their social allure, creating a space that was part spa, part social club, and part, well, something else entirely. The prevailing academic discussion concerning medieval bathhouses often explores the tension between their practical function and their reputation for immorality. Were they truly hotbeds of vice, or were their scandalous reputations largely exaggerated by moralistic commentators who disapproved of mixed-gender public spaces? Regardless, their very existence highlights a fascinating tension in medieval society, the need for public hygiene clashing with perhaps inadvertently facilitating opportunities for sexual activity outside of conventional norms. It's a reminder that even mundane public spaces could become stages for the unspoken desires of the time. From the steamy communal spaces of bathhouses, let's now turn our attention to the medieval understanding of the human body and its ailments, particularly those concerning sexuality. This brings us to medical maladies and misguided cures. You see, without modern scientific understanding, medieval physicians and healers often attributed sexual dysfunctions, infertility, and venereal diseases to imbalances of the body's humors, astrological influences, or even divine punishment. The remedies they prescribed were, by our standards, often bizarre, ineffective, and sometimes even dangerous. Consider the prevailing medical theories of the time. A profound historical fact is that medieval medicine was largely based on the humoral theory derived from ancient Greek physicians like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posited that the human body was composed of four primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that good health depended on a perfect balance of these humors. Sexual function, desire, and fertility were all believed to be directly influenced by these balances. If you experienced a lack of libido, for instance, it might be attributed to an excess of cold, dry humors, requiring a treatment designed to introduce warmth and moisture. You can almost picture a medieval doctor pondering your pallor and temperament before declaring your humors were clearly out of whack for romance. So, what were the cures for sexual ailments? For issues like impotence or infertility, treatments often involved ingesting concoctions designed to heat or moisten the body, like consuming warm spiced wines or a diet rich in eggs, onions, and strong meats. Some remedies were far stranger. For example, for a man struggling with virility, a popular, if truly odd, suggestion involved carrying the dried right testicle of a weasel, yes, the weasel again, as an amulet, or perhaps a poultice made from crushed beetles applied to certain errors. These weren't just folk superstitions. They were often prescribed by educated physicians. It's the kind of thing that makes you appreciate a simple, modern pharmaceutical, doesn't it? Venereal diseases, though not fully understood as sexually transmitted infections, were certainly recognized by their devastating symptoms. They were often attributed to corrupt humors or God's wrath. Treatments for conditions like syphilis, which became more prevalent in the late medieval period, were brutal and ineffective. They included mercury rubs, which caused intense pain, salivation, and often mercury poisoning or aggressive purging through vomiting and bloodletting. The lack of effective treatment meant these diseases spread widely and had horrific long-term consequences, devastating communities. The open, scholarly debate surrounding medieval medicine often focuses on the blurred lines between actual medical practice, superstition, and what we might now call quackery. How much of these treatments were genuinely believed to work, and how much was simply the best guess in an age of limited knowledge? Regardless, the sheer range of bizarre and often painful cures reveals the desperate attempts to understand and control the body's most intimate functions, often with more zeal than actual success. It's a testament to the resilience, or perhaps the sheer desperation, of medieval people that they endured such peculiar medical interventions. From the often misguided medical attempts to cure sexual maladies, let's now turn our attention to a facet of medieval sexuality that was systematically suppressed yet undeniably present: homosexuality. You see, in a society dominated by a church that condemned all non-procreative sexual acts, and particularly those deemed unnatural, same-sex relationships faced severe condemnation and punishment. However, despite this pervasive hostility, evidence suggests that same-sex desire and relationships, both male and female, existed in various forms throughout the period, often hidden in plain sight or through coded expressions. Consider the prevailing theological stance. A profound historical fact is that Christian doctrine, particularly from the High Middle Ages onward, increasingly categorized same-sex acts as a grave sin, often lumped under the umbrella of sodomy, as we discussed earlier. This meant that legal codes, heavily influenced by ecclesiastical law, prescribed harsh penalties, sometimes even death, for those found guilty of such acts. The rhetoric used against these behaviors was often vitriolic, framing them as abominations against God and nature. You can almost feel the weight of this moral condemnation pressing down on any individual who experienced same-sex attractions, forcing them into a life of secrecy and fear. Yet, despite this severe suppression, subtle traces of same-sex desire persist in historical records. For instance, in male monastic communities, where men lived in close quarters under vows of celibacy, strong emotional bonds, sometimes verging on romantic or erotic, undoubtedly formed, while explicit accounts are rare due to the fear of prosecution. Some scholarly interpretations of medieval poetry, letters, or even legal accusations suggest underlying same-sex relationships. These might appear as intense friendships, expressions of profound admiration, or veiled confessions of forbidden love. It's like trying to read between the lines of a highly censored book, where the unspoken often speaks volumes to those who know how to look. For women, the evidence is even scarcer, largely due to the limited historical records pertaining to female experiences in general. However, some historical inquiries point to the existence of intimate female bonds within convents or among single women living together. These relationships, while perhaps not always overtly sexual, certainly involved deep emotional and sometimes physical closeness that challenged heteronormative expectations. The open scholarly debate concerning medieval homosexuality often grapples with the methodological challenges of reconstructing these hidden histories. How do we interpret passionate letters between men, for example, Were they merely expressions of platonic male friendship, or do they hint at deeper romantic or sexual connections? The very act of asking these questions acknowledges that human desire, in all its forms, does not simply disappear because it is condemned. It adapts, it hides, and it finds ways to manifest, leaving subtle clues for later generations to decipher. So, while the official narrative was one of strict prohibition, the reality of medieval sexuality was, as ever, more nuanced and quietly, persistently diverse than the prevailing laws would suggest. From the suppressed realities of same-sex desire, let's now turn to a topic that might genuinely surprise you, challenging common assumptions about medieval life, sex toys, and secret pleasures. You might picture the Middle Ages as utterly devoid of such personal indulgences, a time of strict asceticism where mechanical aids for pleasure simply didn't exist or were unthinkable. However, while overt evidence is scarce due to their private nature and the perishable materials often used, tantalizing clues suggest that medieval people, much like any other era, found ways to seek private gratification. Consider the prevailing cultural climate. A profound historical fact is that despite the Church's strong condemnation of masturbation and non-procreative sexual acts, human beings, then as now, possessed an innate drive for pleasure and self-gratification. This inherent desire did not simply vanish because it was deemed sinful. Instead, it likely found expression in clandestine ways, utilizing whatever materials were at hand. You wouldn't find brightly colored plastic devices advertised in a medieval marketplace. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. Evidence for explicit sex toys from the medieval period is, understandably, extremely rare. Objects that might have served this purpose were often made of wood, leather, cloth, or even hardened clay materials that rarely survive centuries. In archaeological digs, or were deliberately destroyed to avoid scandal. However, some intriguing historical and archaeological discoveries provide glimpses. For instance, medieval medical texts occasionally mention devices used to treat ailments like hysteria in women, which some modern scholars interpret as thinly veiled descriptions of vibrator-like instruments, though their primary purpose was ostensibly therapeutic rather than purely pleasurable. It's like a medieval doctor prescribing a treatment that, by pure coincidence, also happens to be quite enjoyable, beyond specialized devices. It's highly probable that everyday objects were repurposed for personal pleasure. Think of smooth stones, carved pieces of wood, or even tightly rolled cloths or leather. The human imagination, unconstrained by religious prohibitions, is remarkably adept at finding creative solutions for personal needs. The open scholarly debate surrounding these potential artifacts often grapples with the challenge of definitive identification. Is a smooth, oddly shaped piece of wood genuinely a personal pleasure object, or merely a mundane tool whose original function has been lost to time? Without explicit textual descriptions accompanying such finds, interpretation relies on inference and comparative analysis. Nevertheless, the very existence of such discussions and the occasional suggestive find underscores a crucial point. Human sexuality is universal and enduring. Even in an age of intense moral scrutiny and severe punishment for sexual transgressions, individuals found ways to explore their private desires, adapting the materials and circumstances of their lives to create moments of personal, secret pleasure. It reminds us that even in the most rigid societies, the human body and its desires remain a realm of individual autonomy and hidden experience. From the clandestine world of medieval sex toys, Let's now ascend to the ethereal, yet surprisingly carnal, realm of dreams and demonic deceptions. You see, in the medieval mind, the boundary between the waking world and the dream world was far more porous than it is for us today. Dreams were not simply random neurological firings. They were often seen as messages, omens, or, more disturbingly, direct interventions from divine or demonic forces, particularly when it came to sexually charged experiences. Consider the pervasive influence of Christian demonology. A profound historical fact is that the belief in incubi and succubi was widespread and deeply ingrained throughout the Middle Ages. These were specific types of demons. Incubi, from the Latin incubar, to lie upon, were believed to be male. Demons who had sexual intercourse with sleeping women, while succubi, from succubare, to lie beneath, were female demons who had sexual intercourse with sleeping men. These weren't just figures of folklore. They were taken as very real threats, capable of stealing vital bodily fluids, causing illness, or even impregnating women in the case of incubi, sometimes with monstrous offspring or with human offspring. If the demon was thought to have merely collected human semen elsewhere, you can almost feel the terror of a medieval sleeper waking from a vivid, sexually explicit dream, wondering if they had just been visited by a demon. The experience of a nocturnal emission or a sexually charged dream could thus become a source of profound spiritual anxiety. For a medieval person, such an event wasn't just a natural physiological occurrence. It could be interpreted as a direct assault or temptation by a demon. Confessors, as we discussed, would often inquire about such dreams, trying to discern if the individual had harbored impure thoughts beforehand, thereby inviting the demonic visitation, or if they were merely innocent victims. This highlights a peculiar aspect of medieval moral theology. Guilt could be assigned not just for actions, but for involuntary experiences that were believed to be external demonic attacks. It's like being blamed for a nightmare you couldn't control, simply because it involved a subject deemed sinful. The medical and theological treatises of the time extensively discussed these demonic encounters. Physicians sometimes offered natural explanations for such dreams, linking them to diet or an imbalance of humors. But even they often acknowledged the possibility of demonic involvement. The prevailing academic discussion surrounding incubi and succubi often explores their function as explanations for phenomena that were otherwise inexplicable. To the medieval mind, sleep paralysis, vivid dreams, or even unwanted nocturnal emissions, they provided a framework for understanding and attributing responsibility for experiences that were beyond human control. Regardless, the belief in these sexually aggressive demons significantly shaped medieval attitudes towards dreams and nocturnal sexual experiences, imbuing them with a chilling layer of spiritual peril. It truly underscores how deeply the supernatural permeated every aspect of medieval life, even into the most private and unconscious moments. From the unsettling realm of demonic dreamscapes, let's transition to a truly fascinating, almost paradoxical aspect of medieval society: prostitutes and patron saints. You see, while the Church, as we've discussed, vehemently condemned prostitution as a grave sin, and society often marginalized those who engaged in it, there existed a curious blend of condemnation and, surprisingly, a path to spiritual redemption, often embodied by unexpected holy figures. This reveals a nuance in medieval religious thought that goes beyond simple black and white morality. Consider the harsh realities of a prostitute's life, a mainstream historical fact we touched upon earlier. They faced social ostracism, legal vulnerabilities, and the constant threat of violence and disease. Yet, despite being considered sinners, many medieval individuals believed that even the most fallen could find redemption through repentance. This core Christian belief opened a surprising avenue for hope, even for those at the very bottom of the social hierarchy. You can almost see a weary prostitute, perhaps having endured another harsh day, looking towards the distant glimmer of a church window, hoping for some shred of divine mercy. This path to redemption was often personified by specific patron saints, who perhaps surprisingly were associated with penitent sinners, including prostitutes. The most prominent example is Mary Magdalene. While modern scholarship often disputes her historical role as a prostitute, medieval tradition firmly identified her as a repentant sinner, a woman who had fallen into a life of sin but was ultimately redeemed by Christ's forgiveness. Her story, widely propagated through sermons and art, offered a powerful message of hope. No sin was too great for divine mercy, and true repentance could lead to sanctity. She became a powerful intercessor for those seeking to escape a life of sin, including prostitutes. Another interesting figure, though less universally known, is Saint Aphra, a Roman martyr who, according to legend, was a prostitute before her conversion and martyrdom. Her story, though shrouded in legend, further reinforced the idea that a life of sin could be transformed into one of holiness through faith and repentance. These figures provided not just abstract hope, but tangible role models for spiritual transformation. The presence of these patron saints for prostitutes, and the numerous confraternities, religious brotherhoods or sisterhoods, dedicated to reclaiming fallen women and helping them integrate into respectable society, highlights a fascinating duality in medieval thought. On one hand, society condemned the sin. On the other, it often provided avenues for redemption, driven by genuine Christian charity. It's like society was saying, "We disapprove of your profession, but we believe in your soul." This demonstrates that even within a seemingly rigid moral framework, there was room for compassion and the profound belief in the possibility of spiritual rebirth. It's a testament to the enduring power of forgiveness in medieval faith, offering a surprising glimmer of light in an otherwise dark existence for many. From the nuanced spiritual world of repentant prostitutes, let's gallop into a more outwardly chivalric, yet surprisingly sexually charged arena of medieval life, jousts and jaunty jealousy. You see, while tournaments might seem like innocent displays of martial prowess, they were, in fact, highly theatrical events that served as prime venues for social display, political maneuvering, and indeed, subtle and not so subtle expressions of sexual rivalry and courtship. Consider the spectacle itself. A profound historical fact is that tournaments and jousts were immensely popular throughout the medieval period, evolving from brutal mock battles into highly ritualized contests of skill and bravery, particularly favored by the nobility. Knights, clad in gleaming armor, would face off, lances splintering, all cheered on by an eager crowd. But the audience wasn't just made up of common folk. Noble ladies, dressed in their finest attire, occupied prominent positions, their presence central to the entire affair. You can almost feel the electricity in the air, the thundering hooves, the shouts of the crowd, and the subtle, knowing glances exchanged between the stands and the arena. The link between these martial displays and sexual dynamics was deeply ingrained in the culture of chivalry and courtly love. Knights often rode into the lists bearing favors from their ladies, a scarf, a sleeve, a ribbon worn on their helmet, or lance as a visible token of their devotion. Winning a joust was not just a testament to skill. It was a way to publicly honor one's chosen lady, to prove oneself worthy of her admiration, and, perhaps, to subtly assert dominance over romantic rivals. It was a grand, theatrical performance of masculinity and courtship, where every successful strike, every unhorsed opponent was a testament to both martial prowess and amorous dedication. It's like a medieval version of a highly competitive dating show, but with much more pointy bits and considerably higher stakes. The very public nature of these displays could often did fuel intense jealousy and rivalry among the knights themselves, and sometimes among the ladies. A knight performing poorly might feel he had shamed his lady, or worse, that a rival had surpassed him in her eyes. Tales and romances often recount instances where a lady's favor could make or break a knight's reputation, leading to fierce competition. The nuances of these interactions provided ample fodder for gossip and intrigue within the aristocratic circles. The open, scholarly debate concerning medieval tournaments often explores their dual function as both military training and elaborate social rituals. Were they primarily about honing combat skills, or were they more about performing social roles, reinforcing hierarchies, and engaging in a complex dance of courtship and rivalry? Regardless, it's clear that the medieval joust was far more than just a fight. It was a vibrant stage where honor, ambition, and indeed, powerful sexual dynamics played out for all to see. It showcased how even the most ostensibly noble pursuits could be deeply intertwined with matters of desire and social standing. From the thrilling spectacles of jousting and the complexities of courtly affections, let's now turn to a far more somber aspect of medieval life, one that profoundly impacted intimacy and social connection: leprosy and love's limitations. You see, in the Middle Ages, leprosy was a terrifying, incurable, and deeply stigmatized disease. Its visible manifestations, combined with prevailing religious and societal beliefs, led to extreme social isolation for sufferers, fundamentally altering their capacity for conventional relationships and expressions of love. Consider the pervasive fear that leprosy inspired. A profound historical fact is that leprosy, or Hansen's disease, was widely prevalent in medieval Europe. Though the term leprosy often encompassed a broader range of skin conditions, its progressive nature, leading to disfigurement and disability, made it instantly recognizable and deeply feared as contagious. This fear was compounded by theological interpretations that often viewed leprosy as a divine punishment for sin, particularly for sexual transgressions. You can almost feel the chill of dread that would grip a community at the first sign of the disease, leading to immediate and drastic measures. The societal response to leprosy was one of extreme segregation. Those diagnosed were often declared legally dead to society, stripped of their property and legal rights. They were forced to live in leprosaria, leper houses outside town walls, or in isolated huts, forbidden from entering churches, markets, or even touching healthy individuals. They often had to wear distinctive clothing and carry a bell or clapper to announce their presence, warning others to keep their distance. This enforced isolation meant that relationships, including romantic and sexual ones, became virtually impossible within conventional society. The very idea of intimacy with a leper would have been unthinkable for most. Driven by fear of contagion and moral revulsion, this profound social death inevitably led to the cessation of marital relations. A marriage, for all intents and purposes, was dissolved upon diagnosis, as the leper was considered legally deceased. For those already in a relationship, the diagnosis meant an immediate and heartbreaking separation. For those who contracted the disease before marriage, the possibility of finding a partner vanished entirely. The academic discussion surrounding leprosy often explores the complex interplay of medical understanding, religious belief, and social policy that shaped this extreme segregation. Was the isolation primarily driven by a rational fear of contagion? Or was it more fundamentally a moral condemnation and a convenient way to remove undesirables from society? Regardless, the personal cost was immense. It underscores how physical ailment, combined with deeply ingrained societal prejudices and religious interpretations, could erect insurmountable barriers to love, intimacy, and indeed all forms of normal human connection. Leprosy stands as a stark and tragic example of how perceived physical corruption could lead to total social and emotional desolation in the medieval world. From the tragic isolation imposed by leprosy, let's now delve into another desperate and often dangerous attempt by medieval women to control their reproductive lives: herbal remedies and risky abortions. You see, in a time before modern medicine and accessible birth control, women facing unwanted pregnancies often resorted to drastic measures, relying on folk knowledge, secretive practices, and the inherent dangers of potent plants. Consider the immense pressure faced by a woman with an unwanted pregnancy in the Middle Ages. She might be unmarried, facing social ostracism and the stigma of an illegitimate child. She might already have too many children to feed, or her family might be facing extreme poverty. These were not matters of convenience, but often of survival, both for herself and for her existing dependents. A profound historical fact is that, despite the Church's strict condemnation of abortion as a mortal sin, desperate women throughout the medieval period sought ways to terminate pregnancies, often at great personal risk. You can almost feel the weight of their impossible choices, the fear and desperation driving them to dangerous solutions. The primary method for attempting abortion involved the use of various herbal concoctions. Plants like tansy, rue, and savine, which we briefly mentioned in the context of contraception, were also widely known for their abortifacient properties. These herbs were brewed into teas, ingested in various forms, or sometimes applied externally. The knowledge of these plants was often passed down through generations of women, shared quietly among communities, or sometimes administered by local cunning folk or midwives. It was a secret, dangerous medical practice, conducted far from the eyes of official authorities. It's like a medieval underground network, fueled by whispered knowledge and desperate hope. The danger, of course, was immense. The dosage for these herbs was often imprecise, leading to severe poisoning, hemorrhage, permanent injury, or even death for the woman herself. There was no scientific understanding of how these plants interacted with the body, no sterile instruments, and certainly no emergency medical care if things went wrong. The act of attempting an abortion was not only physically perilous, but also spiritually condemned, carrying the threat of excommunication and eternal damnation if discovered and unrepented. The academic discussion surrounding medieval abortion practices often highlights the difficulty of discerning their true prevalence and success rates from historical records, as these were, by their very nature, clandestine acts. Records tend to emerge only when something went terribly wrong, leading to illness, death, or public scandal. Nevertheless, the persistent references to these herbal remedies in medical texts, penitentials which list it as a sin, and legal documents indicate that despite the overwhelming risks and condemnation, women continued to resort to them out of sheer desperation. It speaks volumes about the extreme circumstances women could face and the lengths they would go to, often with their lives on the line, to control their reproductive destinies in a world that offered them very few other options. From the desperate and dangerous acts of seeking abortion, let's now lighten the mood, or perhaps merely shift the nature of the chaos by examining feasts and forbidden fancies. You see, medieval life, for all its strictures and hardships, was punctuated by grand celebrations, festivals, royal coronations, weddings, or the completion of a successful harvest. These feasts were not just about food and drink. They were communal explosions of joy and release, and in their atmosphere of heightened conviviality, they could sometimes dissolve into opportunities for illicit sexual encounters, blurring the lines between joyous revelry and forbidden indulgence. Consider the sheer scale and sensory overload of a medieval feast, particularly one for the nobility. A profound historical fact is that medieval feasts were elaborate, multi-day affairs, involving prodigious amounts of food, wine, music, dancing, and entertainment. They were designed to display wealth, power, and generosity, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, spiced wines flowing freely, and minstrels providing a constant backdrop of song. For the common folk, village fairs and seasonal celebrations also brought similar, if less extravagant, opportunities for communal gathering and release. You can almost smell the roasting boar, hear the raucous laughter, and feel the intoxicating freedom of a night where social norms seemed to loosen their grip just a little dot. In such an environment, inhibitions could drop. The combination of plentiful alcohol, the anonymity provided by large crowds, and the general celebratory atmosphere created fertile ground for flirtations, seductions, and even outright illicit encounters. A discreet corner of a crowded hall, a moonlit garden outside the castle walls, or a shadowed lane during a nighttime procession could become the scene for a stolen kiss or a clandestine rendezvous. It's like a medieval office Christmas party, but with nights and much heavier drinking, leading to some regrettable decisions that might result in a trip to the confessional later. The very nature of these events, their transience and the temporary suspension of rigid daily routines, facilitated a sense of permissiveness. People traveled from far and wide, meaning encounters with strangers were more common, allowing for liaisons that wouldn't be possible in the close-knit, watchful eyes of a home village. The open scholarly debate surrounding the morality and behavior at medieval feasts often grapples with the extent to which these events truly devolved into widespread sexual abandon, or if accounts of their excesses were exaggerated by moralistic commentators eager to preach temperance. Nevertheless, the frequent admonitions against drunkenness and lewd behavior at feasts in sermons and moral treatises suggest that such opportunities were indeed seized upon. It underscores a fundamental truth about human nature. When the pressures of daily life are temporarily lifted, and spirits are high, perhaps a little too high, the pursuit of pleasure, including forbidden fancies, finds a way to emerge. So, while the feast was a joyous celebration of community and bounty, it was also, for some, a discreet stage for desires that usually had to remain hidden from the boisterous, sometimes illicit, revelries of medieval feasts. Let's now turn to a source that offers a remarkably candid and often surprisingly humorous glimpse into the racier side of medieval sexual attitudes, literature's lewd laughter. You see, while religious texts and legal documents painted a picture of strict morality, medieval popular literature, particularly fabliaux farces, and even some narrative poems, delighted in bawdy tales, sexual innuendo, and outright comedic portrayals of illicit affairs. This reveals a disconnect between the official pronouncements and the actual, often earthy humor of the common people. Consider the literary landscape. A profound historical fact is that medieval literature was not solely comprised of epic poems about knights or pious saints' lives. A vibrant tradition of vernacular literature written in everyday language, not Latin, flourished, especially from the 12th century onwards, catering to a wider audience. Among these popular genres were the foblios, short, comic, often crude, verse tales, primarily from France, that reveled in trickery, satire, and sexual escapades. You can almost hear the chuckles and guffaws of a medieval audience gathered round a storyteller, eagerly anticipating the next punchline involving a cheating spouse or a lustful cleric. These foblios and similar comic tales delighted in mocking societal norms and figures of authority, including hypocritical priests, gullible husbands, and cunning wives. They frequently featured explicit sexual situations, though usually described with a comedic rather than erotic intent. For instance, you might find a story about a wife tricking her husband into believing she's invisible so she can sneak off, with her lover or a priest trying and often failing to seduce a parishioner. The humor often derived from the absurdity of the situations, the cleverness of the deception, and the sheer audacity of the characters' desires. It's like a medieval sitcom, but with much more open talk about bodily functions and illicit affairs. The presence of such bawdy literature provides invaluable insight into the actual sexual humor and anxieties of the time, often reflecting what people truly thought, discussed, and laughed about behind closed doors. It suggests a more relaxed and open attitude towards certain sexual topics than what the Church's severe condemnations might imply. While these stories were undoubtedly exaggerations for comedic effect, they must have resonated with common experiences and attitudes to be so popular. The open scholarly debate concerning medieval bawdy literature often focuses on its role as social commentary. Was it merely crude entertainment, or did it serve a deeper purpose in challenging societal hypocrisy and providing an outlet for desires suppressed by religious doctrine? Regardless, these tales remind us that medieval people were not always pious or prudish. They possessed a robust sense of humor, a keen eye for human folly, and a healthy appreciation for the absurdities of sexual desire, even if it involved a few forbidden fancies. It offers a refreshing, if sometimes shocking, contrast to the more serious portrayals of medieval morality. From the bawdy laughter echoing in medieval literature, we now arrive at our final point, reflecting on the legacy of lust and law. You see, as we've journeyed through the bizarre sexual practices of the medieval period, from curious contraceptives and questionable aphrodisiacs to the dark shadows of sodomy, witchcraft, and the public shaming of private sins, it becomes clear that this era was far from monolithic in its approach to human sexuality. It was a complex tapestry woven with threads of strict religious doctrine, pragmatic social realities, enduring folk traditions, and the undeniable force of human desire itself. Consider the overarching narrative. A profound historical fact is that the medieval church, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, exerted an unprecedented degree of influence over moral and sexual conduct throughout Western Europe. Its theological pronouncements on marriage, celibacy, fornication, and unnatural acts shaped legal codes, educational curricula, and individual consciences. This pervasive moral framework was arguably the most dominant force attempting to control and define sexual behavior. You can almost feel the weight of centuries of sermons, confessions, and prohibitions pressing down on every aspect of intimacy, guiding what was considered acceptable and condemning what was deemed sinful. Yet, as we've seen, human nature consistently found ways to navigate, circumvent, or even openly defy these strictures. The existence of regulated brothels, the persistence of clerical concubinage, the desperate use of dangerous herbal remedies for abortion, and the prevalence of bawdy literature all underscore a fundamental truth. Desire is a powerful, universal force that adapts and persists regardless of societal condemnation. The medieval period, therefore, presents us with a fascinating case study in the tension between moral ideals and the messy realities of human experience. It was an era where the sacred and the profane often coexisted, sometimes in surprising harmony, sometimes in violent conflict. The very concept of bizarre itself is subjective, isn't it? What seemed normal to a medieval person, like wearing a dried weasel testicle for contraception, might strike us as utterly outlandish. Conversely, many of our modern attitudes towards sexuality, rooted in concepts of individual autonomy, consent, and diverse expressions of identity, would have been incomprehensible, even heretical, to the medieval mind. The academic discussion surrounding medieval sexuality often emphasizes this cultural relativity. It highlights that while the outward forms of expression and the governing moral frameworks have changed dramatically, the underlying human experiences of love, lust, jealousy, and the desire for intimacy remain fundamentally recognizable across the centuries. It's a compelling reminder that though the specifics evolve, the core drives of humanity are surprisingly timeless. So, what is the ultimate legacy of these medieval sexual practices and the laws that governed them? They offer a rich, often uncomfortable, but always illuminating mirror through which to view our own societal norms and values concerning sexuality. They reveal the enduring human struggle to reconcile spiritual aspirations with bodily desires, social order with individual freedom. As you drift off now, perhaps with a newfound appreciation for modern plumbing and contraceptive methods, remember that the echoes of these medieval tensions and desires continue to resonate, shaping our understanding of sexuality, morality, and the complex, often bizarre, journey of human experience through time. Sweet dreams.